This episode is a trackpads.com production.
If Cambrai is often remembered as the moment when tanks seemed to break the deadlock of the Western Front, Flesquières is the place where that story suddenly becomes harder, more honest, and more interesting. On the opening day, while British units on either side made dramatic progress, the attack at Flesquières did not go to plan. Tanks were knocked out, infantry momentum faltered, and a village that looked like just one more objective on the map became a local crisis with wider consequences. That matters because Flesquières was not simply a stubborn point of resistance inside a successful battle. It was where the British discovered, almost in real time, that even a brilliantly designed opening attack could be checked by a combination of terrain, artillery skill, defensive preparation, and the small failures of coordination that decide whether surprise becomes breakthrough or only a temporary breach. This podcast is accompanied by a companion book that expands the story of the Battle of Cambrai, with additional historical context, maps, and dozens of enhanced colorized photographs from the battle. Your purchase helps support our mission to keep these podcasts free. You can find the book at militaryauthor.me or at trackpads.com. The ground itself helps explain why this happened. Flesquières stood on rising ground, with the approaches shaped by the slope that British attackers had to cross, and by positions behind the crest that gave German gunners a cruel advantage once tanks began to appear. In military terms, this was defensive terrain of a very dangerous kind. Guns placed on or behind a reverse slope could remain hard to spot until the attackers came into view and then fire over open sights at close and deadly ranges. The village itself, with its walls, buildings, and trench connections, was not just a collection of houses. It was part of a defensive system that could absorb the shock of the first assault and then turn the landscape into a killing ground for any force that arrived in the wrong order or without enough support. British planning had not ignored Flesquières, but the logic of the wider attack made its capture especially important. The 51st Highland Division was tasked with advancing through this sector in the left center of the offensive, and success there mattered not only for the division itself, but for the shape of the whole British thrust. If Flesquières fell quickly, the neighboring gains at Havrincourt, Ribecourt, and farther east could connect more cleanly. The advance would become less jagged, and the route toward deeper objectives would look more promising. If it held, the village would stand like a wedge inside the British line of progress, exposing flanks, interfering with movement, and buying the Germans precious time. So the fighting there was never just a local disappointment. It was a delay at one of the exact points where timing mattered most. And in a battle built around surprise and momentum, delay could be as dangerous as outright defeat. The attack in this sector became controversial almost immediately, and much of that controversy centered on how the Highland Division worked with its tanks. In later retellings, Major General George Harper often appears as the man whose mistakes supposedly ruined the day, usually because his infantry were not kept close enough to the advancing tanks. There is some truth in the criticism, because tanks needed nearby infantry not only to exploit gaps, but to suppress machine guns, deal with field guns, and identify strongpoints before the machines blundered into them. Yet the simpler version of the story goes too far. The methods used under the Fourth Corps were not uniquely Harper's invention, and neighboring formations used similar ideas with better results elsewhere. That means the failure at Flesquières cannot be explained by one doctrinal sin committed by one general. The real story is less comforting. A difficult local battlefield exposed weaknesses in timing and cooperation that might have mattered less on easier ground, but became critical here. Once the attack moved into the village sector, the German defense proved far more dangerous than the British hoped. The defenders did not merely sit and wait for tanks to run over them. German field artillery in this area had been trained to fight tanks, and that fact is central to understanding what happened. Rather than being surprised into paralysis, the gun crews held their fire until British tanks presented themselves on the skyline or against the slope, then engaged them directly. This was the kind of practical anti-tank defense that later generations would take for granted. But in 1917, it still carried the force of a battlefield discovery. A tank was not invulnerable. If brought under accurate direct fire from a well-sighted field gun, it could be disabled, set ablaze, or turned into an obstacle for the machines following behind. At Flesquières, that lesson arrived with unusual violence. The scene on the slope was therefore very different from the smoother advances that had taken place elsewhere that morning. Instead of a rolling armored penetration supported by infantry moving through crushed wire, the British in this sector ran into a defense that remained coherent long enough to strike at the tanks as they came on. Some tanks pushed forward bravely into fire that grew more intense the farther they climbed. Others were hit before they could properly support the infantry. The stout wall around the chateau grounds, machine gun fire from the village approaches, and artillery firing from beyond the crest combined to break up the rhythm of the advance. The result was not instant collapse, but a grinding check at precisely the place where the British had least wanted one. Units nearby continued to gain ground, yet Flesquières stood out as a painful interruption in the otherwise impressive first-day narrative. Numbers from the fighting vary depending on what is counted and by whom, but the broad picture is clear enough. A significant cluster of British tanks was knocked out or disabled in and around the Flesquières sector, and that cluster was large enough to create the impression that something had gone fundamentally wrong there, even while the wider battle still seemed promising. Some accounts focus on the tanks destroyed by artillery fire. Others include breakdowns and vehicles stranded by terrain, and still others fold neighboring actions into the total. What matters for the listener is not the precise arithmetic, but the effect. Enough tanks were lost in the area to choke the attack, to leave infantry exposed, and to hand the Germans a breathing space they had been denied elsewhere on the front. Flesquières did not destroy the British offensive, but it interrupted its internal connection, and that interruption mattered strategically out of all proportion to the village's size. This is why the place acquired such symbolic importance so quickly. On the first day of Cambrai, British troops elsewhere had shown that a major trench system could be broken into with surprise, predicted artillery fire, and massed tanks. Flesquières, by contrast, became the place where people asked why the breakthrough had not become something larger. A village holding out amid neighboring gains created a dangerous shape in the British advance, leaving a salient that had to be managed rather than a cleanly expanding gap through which follow-on forces could move freely. The problem was not simply embarrassment. As long as Flesquières remained in German hands, it threatened the flanks of nearby formations and made exploitation more confused and risky. So when later writers pointed to this sector as a turning point, they were not being melodramatic. They were recognizing that big outcomes in battle often turn on the one place where the local clock stops, while the wider plan keeps running. The most famous explanation for the British check came wrapped in a dramatic and highly personal story. After the battle, Douglas Haig's dispatch described how many of the hits on British tanks at Flesquières had been made by a German artillery officer who supposedly remained alone at his battery, serving a field gun single-handed until he was killed at his post. It was a striking image and a memorable one, and that alone helps explain why it spread so quickly. Industrial battle is hard to narrate. Smoke, broken communications, overlapping batteries, and confused timing do not lend themselves easily to legend. A lone defender standing by one gun and smashing tank after tank is a story people can remember. It also flatters certain instincts in military culture because it turns a complex local failure into a tale of exceptional individual bravery. Admirable or not, it is a much neater explanation than the truth usually allows. The trouble is that the story does not hold up well when examined closely. Later research, on both the British and German sides, found very little firm evidence that a single man, acting alone, accounted for the British losses at Flesquières. German memory later attached the tale to Theodor Kruger, though even there details shifted over time, including his rank, the exact circumstances, and whether he matched the original account at all. Other names were proposed, and the number of tanks allegedly destroyed by this lone figure grew in retelling, sometimes from a handful to 16 or more. That inflation is a warning sign. Myths in military history often begin with a fragment of truth, and then gather certainty they have not earned. The simplest, reliable conclusion is that there may well have been acts of great bravery by individual German gunners at Flesquières, but the famous lone gunner version is almost certainly a distortion rather than a solid description of what actually happened. The more convincing explanation is broader and less theatrical. Flesquières was defended by more than one gun, more than one crew, and more than one good local decision. German artillery units in the sector had anti-tank training. The ground gave them favorable firing conditions, and the British attack there suffered from a combination of tactical distance, incomplete suppression, and the simple problem that tanks cresting a slope under direct observation become much easier targets than tanks still masked by ground. In addition, not every tank loss in the area came from one cause. Some vehicles were hit by artillery, some broke down, and some were disabled in ways that later memory folded together into one dramatic narrative. When a battle is observed through smoke and stress, people naturally compress events into stories that feel meaningful. The lone gunner story survived not because it fully explained Flesquières, but because it provided a human face for a much larger and less comfortable reality. There is another reason the myth endured, and it has to do with what both sides needed from the battle afterward. For the British, the story offered a kind of emotional convenience. It suggested that the failure at Flesquières came from one extraordinary act rather than from the interaction of imperfect planning, difficult terrain, and a German defense that had adapted more quickly than expected. For the Germans, the tale offered a heroic image of resistance against the new armored threat, a reassuring reminder that courage and skill could still master the machine. These needs are understandable, but they can mislead. The real significance of Flesquières lies not in one soldier standing alone against history, but in the way a single local defense exposed the limits of an emerging battlefield system. Tanks had changed the fight, but they had not abolished the importance of field artillery, local command skill, and close infantry cooperation. What makes the whole story even more revealing is that Flesquières did eventually fall, but not in the dramatic way the opening plan intended. The Germans abandoned the village during the night, and British troops occupied it on the following day. That fact matters because it reminds us that the defense at Flesquières, successful as it was in the short term, did not represent an impregnable fortress. It represented delay, and delay was enough. By holding out through the first crucial day, the Germans damaged the coherence of the British advance and helped prevent the opening shock from turning into something even more dangerous. In warfare, time is often more valuable than ground. The defenders at Flesquières did not need to keep the village forever to shape the battle. They only needed to hold it long enough to break the tempo on which British hopes depended. So Flesquières deserves its place in the Cambrai story, not as an embarrassing footnote, but as one of the battle's most revealing moments. It showed that tanks could be checked by properly handled field artillery, that one awkward sector could deform the gains made elsewhere, and that myth would rush in almost immediately to simplify what battlefield reality had made complicated. It also showed something more enduring. The birth of armored warfare was not a clean march from novelty to mastery. It was a rough education conducted under fire, full of breakthroughs that were real, setbacks that were equally real, and explanations that sometimes said more about memory than about events. Flesquières mattered because it interrupted a triumph and forced everyone to confront the harder truth. Even the most modern ideas in war still rise or fail on the stubborn details of ground, timing, and human coordination. You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.